Hello, I'm Dave Emory, and this is side one of For the Record program number 678, interview with Paul Fitzgerald and Liz Gould. This program is being recorded on July 5th of the year 2009, and it is my pleasure and my privilege to bring to our airwaves Paul Fitzgerald and Liz Gould, the author of the consummately important recent book, Afghanistan's Untold Story, published in softcover by City Lights Books. Paul and Liz, welcome to our airwaves.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Dave.
In describing books, one sometimes sees a munitions metaphor used. You'll see references to a book as a literary bombshell or a blockbuster of a book. Usually those munitions metaphors are applied more commonly to film or other events. I'd like to construct a munitions metaphor for your book that I think is absolutely appropriate. There's been a devastating type of aerial munition that has come into use in the last several decades called a cluster bomb. It's an aerial drop munition in which, after the original bomb explodes, it scatters little bomblets all over the ground, which then go off over a long period of time and can really be quite devastating if used, when the actual weapon is used. And I think in many ways your book could be described as a literary cluster bomb, because in addition to the overall detonation, the overall impact of the book itself, there are all sorts of little bomblets that are scattered throughout the book and are inextricably linked with the actual subject material. And before we get into the book itself, I'd like to give the audience a short taste of the actual text and of the kind of material that is available here to their literary and intellectual palate. On 259, in talking about some of the operators on the ground working on their own, and also a subject I'd perhaps like to come back to at greater length in a future interview, namely the paramount role of the narcotics traffic in the Afghan imbroglio, you write on page 259, a wonderful little bomblet here. Author and activist Rob Schultes, who'd covered the Mujahideen for Time magazine during the war against the Russians, continued to hold very strong opinions on how the Afghan heroin problem went global. Quote, "My theory is that a lot of the policy decisions that were made here that were so inexplicable were produced by corruption on a local level by CIA station chiefs and lower. I actually know some things about that. Somebody I know in Washington told me, quote, 'This is all I'm going to say to you. The planes flew in full, and they flew out full. That's all I'm going to say.' You know, a lot of fortunes have been made in Langley. I think a lot of the dirty things that went on at that level and a lot of what's happening today is being done by friends of those people covering for them at this point because they don't want to see old Colonel Klutz or whomever going to prison. And I think the stuff's probably still going on because of that." Schultes minced no words about CIA culpability for 9/11 and the hideous betrayal of both American and Afghan lives being covered up by the blanket secrecy imposed by the War on Terror. "I worked for the agency briefly on my way out of college. My father was a lifer at the agency. Now I find them morally repulsive. The majority of them should be in prison who were in charge of the Afghan-Pakistani operation. They're directly responsible for 9/11 happening. They were getting paid a lot of money to make sure that wasn't going to happen, and they didn't do anything." That is the sort of material with which your book is filled. Those are the sort of little bomblets that are contained in this cluster bomb of a book. And what I'd like to do would be to give the audience some background on how all of this came to be. How did the planes come to be flying in full and coming out full? And beyond that, how did we find ourselves entangled in this horrendous, bloody, and seemingly inextricable imbroglio?
Well, you know, what we wanted to do, Dave, is to give people the feel of what it's like on the ground without that kind of middleman thing that you get from a news editor. We had experienced that ourselves, and the first time that we went there in 1981 for CBS News, we saw a story that was very different than the kind of us against them Cold War rehash that we were seeing on the evening news, that all the major news operations were maintaining. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to cut through the BS and get to the point of what exactly was going on there. And over the next few years, we were able to do that. We did that in 1981. We brought our stuff back to CBS News, plop the tapes on the desk, and the guy looks at us and says, there's not really very much here. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, we're looking for Russians. And I said, well, that's not necessarily the story. And to which he replied, well, I didn't read that in the New York Times. So that was the attitude that we faced. And then again in 1983, in order to get around that kind of blockade, we brought Roger Fisher from the Harvard Negotiation Project back with us to Afghanistan to talk with the Russians to see what it would take to get them to go home. Now, President Jimmy Carter had said specifically that it was the greatest threat, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was the greatest threat to peace since World War II. Well, that being the case, if we can get them to go home, then we'll take away a very, very serious threat to our existence. And we discovered that the U.S. media and the United States government had absolutely no interest in getting the Soviets to go home. They were busy holding them down there with a covert campaign, which everyone knew outside of the United States was going on. It was being published, stories about it were being published in Canada and in Europe. The Soviets certainly knew there was a covert campaign going on. The Pakistanis, Afghans, Iranians, Indians, et cetera, the American public didn't know it. And so when you get an event like 9/11, or you get this massive drug dealing that was supporting the Mujahideen that grew up in the 1980s, there have always been drugs in that part of the world, but they were contained. They were really under a great deal of organized control with the help of the United States and the Soviet Union with these various governments. But all of these things have been so entirely corrupted at this point that there is no way to even contain it.
Well, in truth, though, when you pull back to when we really originally noticed Afghanistan, it actually was at a time, 1979 was when President Jim to office, basically he was really coming in with the idea that we were going to reduce arms spending. And that was a really big deal at the time. There was the negotiation of the SALT Treaty that was basically attempting to be negotiated, and it was very important at the time. This was the post-Vietnam War era. There was a revelation going on inside the Beltway that the idea that you could really just use military endlessly and solve any kind of problem anywhere in the world was really being questioned. So we were really looking at that point to a new kind of really competition with the Soviets. It was going to go from military competition much more into civilian competition. And what happened was interesting because we were working on the documentary about this issue. We were interviewing people like John Galbraith and Paul Warnke, who negotiated the treaty. Galbraith made it very clear, in fact, that at that moment in time, we really needed to reinvest in the civilian economy, that we really had reached the point of the diminishing returns. When you spend so much in the military, you actually undermine your civilian economy. So this was all part of the thinking. Well, what happened on December 27th, 1979, seemed miraculous to us. All of a sudden, the Soviets crossed the border to a neighboring country that was not considered even a part of America's interest at that point. It was not considered strategic to the United States. And it was suddenly a reason to literally turn back the clock on negotiation on any kind of relationship with the Soviets that would reduce arms spending. It seemed within a matter of days there was the discussion had shifted from reduced arms spending and what we were going to do with that for the civilian economy, and suddenly it was how much were we going to increase the defense budget. And that really did get our attention right up front. We just wondered what could have happened. How did this happen? So the sense that some decision had been made long before the Soviets crossed the border, that feeling, that impression was very obvious. And so as we began to notice this story, the Soviets actually what happened was the Western media had gotten kicked out of Afghanistan within weeks after the Soviet invasion. And then there was a blackout. And that became our opportunity because the stories at that point were so fantastic about what was happening. It seemed that it needed a new set of eyes to look at it. So that's really what got us started on the whole process. And of course, in 30 years, what we've discovered is that there was a huge backstory that goes back, really it goes back in specifically for Afghanistan, you really have to pull the clock back into almost post-World War II. You have to pull the clock back, when the beginning of the origins of the national security state starting, and the idea of an endless competition, a military competition with the Soviets, it was really started at that point.
You really have to look back to the British Empire. The United States inherited the obligations of the British Empire in 1947 when they partitioned India. And the center of the British Empire's global efforts centered around Afghanistan. Now, what's so very interesting about that is that the United States inherited that responsibility in 1947, but it had so many other areas of interest and influence around the world that it never really paid very much attention to it. In fact, the bureaucracy in Washington is so stolid that it never even, the old expression we have around here, dawn breaks over Marble Head. Well, it never broke over Washington until 1953 that actually the United States might have some kind of interests in Afghanistan. That was when their Prime Minister, Mohammed Daoud, who was the cousin of the King Zahir Shah, decided, after having asked the United States for financial and military assistance to get some basic things done in Afghanistan, and after being rebuffed by the Dulles brothers, the Secretary of State and CIA director in the 1950s under the Eisenhower administration, he turned towards the Soviet Union and Nikita Khrushchev, and of course they were very happy to supply him with the 100-bed hospital, the 50 city buses, the concrete factories so that they could pave the roads, et cetera, that they had been asking the United States to offer them. So that was the beginning. At that point, Afghanistan finally got America's attention, but it was still and remains to this day the center of this global focus on pressing into Eurasia, which was defined by people like Mackinder, the geographer Mackinder, British geographer, late 19th century, and carried into the Nazi regime with Karl Haushofer as an example.
One of the concepts that you introduced to your readers, and something that I've been talking about for years in conjunction with the wars on the Eurasian landmass in which we're currently enmeshed, and that is the concept of the Earth Island or World Island. I wonder if you could encapsulate that for us.
That whole idea came about, we refer to it as mystical imperialism. The whole idea that the British Empire, when they started out in essentially 1600, Queen Elizabeth I chartered the East India Company, which went into, bit by bit, into India, established trading posts in various parts of India, and over a period of time became a de facto ruler. It was this was the nature of combining God's will of Christianizing the world with the corporate structure. Okay? In fact, the United States, Plymouth Plantation and the plantation in Virginia were started as businesses. They weren't started as colonies that these individuals intended to populate. They were started as corporations, essentially, for the objective of creating this kind of new Earth. The new Atlantis, I believe, is what they referred to it as. You had Bacon and Milton talking about some of these things and creating this new way in which the planetary the powers of the planetary system and the stars could be invested here on the Earth and reform a corrupted nature. If you read some of John Dee's stuff as an example, Queen Elizabeth I's astronomer and philosopher, you get a lot of this stuff. I mean, this is what was going on in that time period, and over time it gradually, what Dee and what these original spiritualists evolved into was physics. A lot of the chairs that were formed in the 17th century at Oxford and Cambridge and these various universities in Britain, as an example, which were held by alchemists originally, are now held by physicists. Okay, so the whole idea was to translate nature, and that would be God's work. So that is at the core of what was going on in the 19th century. It began to evolve. They began to see Britain was an island nation. Well, they began to look at Russia as a land island surrounded by other lands. And when the Russians began to build railroads and began to explore into these areas and colonize and civilize, in their case, they were breaking down the tribal structure. They were bringing Western forms of civilization to these areas in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan and those southern, what eventually became the southern republics of the Soviet Union. What they were doing was seen by Britain as a great threat. They saw that what the Russians were capable of doing in this world island, which they considered to be Eurasia, that the Russians were control over, was the same thing that they had done with their naval forces on the oceans of the world from their island. So they really, a kind of philosophical panic set in right at the core of the British ruling structure and their financial structure, because that is what their trade around the world is what had made them a great power. They were just an impoverished, despite all the propaganda that we get today about the wonders of Elizabethan England and the courts and the castles and the knights and all that stuff. That's Hollywood. The fact is that as of 1600, Britain was a very, very small island nation with very much of a backward culture that had yet to really explore the world in any meaningful sense, and had to keep up with the Portuguese fleets and the Spanish fleets and the Dutch and a lot of other nations who were already ahead of them in that part of the world.
In fact, that was one of the reasons why the British Empire felt that it really needed to really colonize Afghanistan. When it was dealing with the Indian Empire, its Indian Empire, it was looking at Russia coming down and putting pressure on on the northern side of Afghanistan. It viewed that as an encroachment on its empire. So you can see the same configuration that certainly went on today between, what was the proxy war with the United States and the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union was a replacement for the kind of attitude that the British Empire brought to the region in the 19th century. But when they fought 3 wars, with the Afghans, they really didn't do very well. They were not able to effectively colonize Afghanistan. And what happened by the end of the 19th century was the fact, out of absolute frustration, an arbitrary line was drawn dividing Afghanistan's Pashtun homelands west from the Hindu Kush to the Indus River, and that effectively divided in half. There are something like they claim up to like 40 million Pashtuns that live on the western side, on the eastern side, and on the western side you have something like 20 million Pashtuns that are still in Afghanistan. That's all part of these crisis areas that the Pakistanis are having such a difficult time with. Well, this line was created in 1893 by Mortimer Durand as a solution to the fact that the British could not colonize Afghanistan. And what they did is they simply arbitrarily decided to create a sphere of influence, effectively, and the British would control the eastern side of it and the Afghans would control the western side of it. But it was never an accepted delineation to actually separate Afghanistan from its own homelands, Pashtun homelands.
Now remember that these areas that were divided on the British side of the border, this was never set up to be a democratically elected state. The area that became Pakistan in 1947 was set up as a corporation. It was set up by the East India Company and divided up by the East India Company in the 18th and 19th century in order to govern it as agencies. The company would appoint an agent to run that particular tribal area, and that agent would then be the judge and jury for that particular group of people. And he had absolute power and authority over that. So this was all kind of like a corporate manager. He was like the company manager, would come in and manage your district, your town, for the benefit and behalf of the British Empire and for the East India Company.
And that's one of the reasons why today Pakistan really, in some ways has really not matured in terms of its as a state. It has not gone through a lot of the natural growth processes.
Ahmed Rashid has even stated that the intent was to keep those agencies, those places backwards. They were forbidden from political organizing. In 1947, there was a plebiscite where the Pashtuns were supposed to vote as to where they would go, whether they would go back with Afghanistan or whether they would become an independent nation unto themselves inside with autonomy inside Pakistan. And pretty much the British government went around arresting all the Pashtun leaders and closing down the Pashtun newspapers. And the vote, of course, was something like 50.5% voted to stay inside Pakistan. So, but the problem was that the majority of the Pashtuns had been either locked up or killed or weren't able to participate in the election. So this is what Afghanistan has been protesting since 1893 when this border was implemented upon them, and it is still today the source of the problem that the United States just had to put 17,000 more troops into that area, that specific area, in order to deal with the instability that has been caused by this British decision in 1897 to keep those areas backward.
Most Americans, all they really know about Afghanistan are rugs or maybe hashish in some subcultures. But one of the things that you point out not only is that the area has a long history, but that there are many different ethnic groups whose political and social dynamics have affected what is taking place today. I'd like to sort of move into the events of the Cold War, and you've already illustrated that the United States in many ways sort of picked up the British tab in that part of the world, and what had been a dynamic of the British Empire, namely the myth of the 10-foot-tall Russian, then became almost a religious element of American Cold War ideology. Two of the things that you point out that set the stage for the ongoing tragedy there, one was the ascension of Team B, and in connection with that, the ascension of one Zbigniew Brzezinski. Explain how that impinges on the entire situation here.
Well, what you've got is, at the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, the defense establishment in the United States, the whole concept of the military-industrial complex, the Cold War, all of it had really spent itself. There were people within the industry itself who warned. Paul Nitze, as an example, who's considered to be the founder of the initiator of the Cold War, along with George Kennan. Kennan kind of had second thoughts about the way in which the institution was using his information. He was the famous Mr. X. And so he was fired, and Paul Nitze was brought in order to direct it. Well, Paul Nitze warned in the late 1950s, early 60s about the escalation of Vietnam. He said specifically, he's referred to, by the way, as the vicar of foreign policy. He stated that he thought that the United States would use up its war energy by going to war in Vietnam, that it was a bad idea, that our real enemy were the Russians, and that's what had to be focused on. And as a result of that, I mean, Nitze had been in there from the very beginning. He'd been in the government during World War II. A lot of these people, by the way, moved from Wall Street back and forth. Okay, you'll discover that Goldman Sachs thing comes in quite often, even with Afghanistan. So to get back to my point is that what happens is that 1975 comes along, the United States vacates Vietnam, the military and industrial complex is in a state of shock. Okay. The whole idea behind America, the American economy, and the American way of making war is high technology. The United States solves problems with B-52s. When our guys overseas get into trouble, what do? They call the Predator drone guys, they call the F-16s, and they come in and they drop a 1,000-pound bomb or a 2,000-pound bomb on a village. That's the way they do it. That's our technology. Well, they're discovering today in Afghanistan that technology, of course, has the limits. You kill people that are supposed to be your friends, and they turn on you. Well, that's what happened at the end of 1975. So a group was convened. George Bush got into the White House. Of course, we had just had this whole calamity with Richard Nixon. Gerald Ford is the president. George Bush is his CIA director. A group of right-wing conservatives and neoconservatives, same as they are today, go to the president and they basically say they go to George Bush and they say, we need a special evaluation of what the Soviet Union is doing. We don't think the CIA is doing a very good job. And so, for the first time, in an unprecedented move, George Bush allowed this group, and this group was called Team B, as opposed to Team A being the standard national intelligence estimate CIA people who did the estimates of what the Soviets were up to. Well, these Team B guys come in with this ideological agenda, which is a right-wing ideological agenda with the intention of ginning up the defense budget, recreating the Cold War once again, and guess what? They discover that the entire CIA's national intelligence estimate is all wrong. All those things that you thought the Soviets weren't going to do, they are going to do. Tanks are going to come rolling down Pennsylvania Avenue any day now. But any one of these days, they're going to roll over one of their borders, and all heck is going to break loose, and that's going to be the end of the world. And it's all because the liberals are too weak on defense, and we have to do something. We have to have this enormous increase in our defense budget. So this is 1976. Well, over the next 3 years, they work on the public relations campaign. They form various groups. There's a number of people who are involved in this: Madison Avenue types, Wall Street types, defense industry people, the biggest corporations. Simultaneously, Jimmy Carter gets elected and picks Zbigniew Brzezinski as his national security advisor. Zbigniew Brzezinski is a longtime Russophobe. He hates Russia. He is a Polish exile. He believes that the Eastern Europe needs to be freed immediately, which it did. But the fact is that his intent was to do it, to use the levers of the United States government and to use Afghanistan in order to make that happen. So what happens is that from the middle of 1978, he wrestles control politically of the Directorate of Operations, which is the business end of the CIA. These are the guys who go into countries and overthrow them. He wrestles that away from Cyrus Vance in the State Department and takes control of covert operations. Well, within the next 18 months, the Soviets are invading Afghanistan. And so when we saw this happening, we said, we were doing our documentary in 1979 called The Arms Race and the Economy, talking to all these people, and we said, wait a minute, this is just too convenient. There's got to be a backstory here. There's something huge current flowing underneath the surface here. So, of course, what we did was we got involved in 1979 with our documentary, Arms Race and the Economy, go to Afghanistan in 1981, go back in 1983, only to essentially confirm our original thesis, was that these guys from Team B had managed to cook up a scenario whereby the Soviets were convinced that the United States was preparing to make a nuclear war on them, that the United States was turning back to the hardliners, and so their hardliners took over. And we over the period of time, we began to come up with all kinds of information. I mean, one of the things that was a big concern was the Shah of Iran back in the 1970s, as you recall. Okay, he was operating as America's client.
Paul, I'd like to jump in here. We are almost out of time on this side. I'd like to just point something out for the benefit of younger listeners, and then we'll continue with this on the other half-hour side of this program. The hatching of Team B and the unholy grail, so to speak, was passed from the Ford White House to the Carter White House and Citizen Brzezinski. But many of the people that younger listeners have seen on the political stage in recent years, such as Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, were part of the Ford White House and were part of this team. And, of course, the George Bush who brought in Team B was the elder George Bush, for whom CIA headquarters is named, and the father of the fellow who recently and mercifully just left office. We are speaking with Paul Fitzgerald and Liz Gould, the authors of the very important recent book, Afghanistan's Untold Story, published in softcover by City Lights Books. And we're going to be returning to the narrative of just how we got stuck in this horrible mess and who the people were who helped to see to it that we got stuck there in Side 2. This concludes Side 1 of For the Record program number 678, interview with Paul Fitzgerald and Liz Gould. This is being recorded on July 5th of the year 2009. For Paul and Liz, this is Dave Emory saying thanks for listening. Hello, my name's Dave Emory, and this is Side 2 of For the Record program number 678, interview with Paul Fitzgerald and Liz Gould. And this program is being recorded on July 5th of the year 2009. Once again, it is my pleasure and privilege to bring to our airwaves Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, the authors of Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, just published in softcover by City Lights, and arguably the best and most comprehensive history of the tragic involvement of first the Soviet Union and then the United States in that country. Paul and Liz, welcome back once again to our airwaves.
Well, thank you, Dave.
Thank you so much.
We're here in the Silicon Valley, and you have a website that you should be. Let's mention that website to the audience, and I'm going to assume that that's one of the places where people can order the book.
Absolutely. Well, you'll get linked directly to where you can buy the book, and it's invisiblehistory.com. You can also go to citylights.com. We're certainly listed there, too, and many other locations, too. All
righty. And again, the title of the book, Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story. And because of this book, it is no longer an untold story, undertold perhaps, but no longer untold, and we're going to tell some more of it right now. Now, at the conclusion of Side 1, we were talking about what set the stage for the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Now, people may recall, and younger listeners should be aware of the fact that when this happened, it was all portrayed as the 10-foot-tall Russians, the menacing Soviets beginning to gobble up the entire world by having an Afghan sandwich, so to speak. And one of the things that you point out is that there was a whole lot more to this, and that if anything, whereas we were told this was an unqualified act of Soviet aggression and a calumny and a travesty of the First Order, that really the shoe was on the other foot. You were talking about Team B and how Team B passed the unholy grail to Zbigniew-Brzezinski. Perhaps encapsulate that again for us, and then explain how it is that the Soviets invaded Afghanistan.
Well, Team B really created the sort of the ideological foundation, but really in the form of a document. The Team B report really was an actual document that competed with what was referred to as Team A, which would have been the traditional way that the CIA was analyzing the Soviet threat and intentions. And Zbigniew Brzezinski gets in as President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor and effectively brings in the mandate, effectively, of what the Team B analysis really was putting out, which was very much expressing its belief that the Soviets were definitely going to be crossing a border and were going to be provoking and doing things that were going to fulfill the prophecy of Team B, which was that this is an expansionist state that has to be dealt with only with military solutions. So when Zbigniew Brzezinski gets into the White House and starts to really put out the agenda, which actually included a black project that actually was signed by President Carter, this is at least what has been admitted to. Okay, and this would have been in 1978, in July of 1978.
6 months before the
6 months. Sorry, wrong date. 1979. That President Carter had authorized a black project that allowed for the provocation, intentionally trying to draw the Soviets into what Zbigniew Brzezinski, in a later interview in 1998, referred to as the Afghan trap. That, in fact, the way Brzezinski even describes it was that they were knowingly enhancing the chances that the Soviets would invade. They weren't. This was the intent of this kind of provocation. And there was also a propaganda campaign to try and put out all kinds of disinformation that would further spook the Soviets into believing that they had to invade in order to stabilize what was going on in Afghanistan. And when, in fact, the Soviets did cross the border in December of 1979, President Carter referred to that as the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War. So this is the same president who 6 months earlier signed a project that allowed for this intentional provocation on the Soviet southern border. The other facts that are interesting, too, is that during that 6-month period, and even before, the Soviets were sending all kinds of signals to the United States that they were very anxious about the instability and the situation going on there. There was such concern about it. The Soviets actually expressed their desire to bring the king of Afghanistan back from exile to try and bring a stability to Afghanistan. And that was none of these ideas were taken seriously. These were ideas that got lost. And once the Soviets crossed the border, an additional piece of propaganda was put out that the Soviets were running out of oil, and that this was their first step to the Persian Gulf, and this was really what was going to be. We had to deal with this. So this allowed for an immense reorganization of the entire military-industrial complex.
So you see, at the time, I know some of your younger listeners are not unfamiliar with the idea of games. I mean, video games and the kinds of things that are done, strategy games, that sort of thing. Okay, but back in the 1970s, the average American was not into that kind of game playing. You might have had some people who played chess once in a while, or on an esoteric basis, or appreciated it. Okay, but the whole idea of gaming another country was just so beyond the political pale that was just not something that entered into a daily discussion. Well, when you get to Afghanistan and you've got this legacy coming from the British Empire in the 19th century with redcoats marching into these areas and fighting these fierce tribal warriors up in the mountains, you've got this whole idea that got inculcated into military academies, and it got inculcated into diplomatic circles. And that was what was going on in 1970s. And you've got these people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is a game player. And Afghanistan has been referred to as the great game. Now, the fact is that it's become kind of a cliche at this point about it being the great game. But it really is. It's a very, very sophisticated operation that was going on here. And what Brzezinski starts to do in 1978 and 1979 with his efforts is largely propaganda, but there were other covert efforts that were being done off the books by other organizations from other countries. China, as an example, was very much involved. The Chinese involvement to this day really has not been brought forward in terms of what they were doing back in the 1970s with the assistance and support of the United States in order to train Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, as an example, in areas like Xinjiang province, okay? So this is the kind of thing that was going on. And so what Brzezinski and Robert Gates, who was the deputy director of the CIA at the time, and he's admitted this as well, is that they set out to have the Soviets, to convince the Soviets that Afghanistan was going to be turned over to the United States, that there was instability there, that the United States was essentially going to go into Iran with a military force as the Shah fell, and that the so-called Marxist leader, Hafizullah Amin, would then invite the United States from Iran into Afghanistan, and the Soviet Union would have lost this very strategic border area that they were concerned about. In the meantime, there was a report that was put out in 1977 by the Central Intelligence Agency that stated that the Soviet Union was running out of oil. Now, we know today that the Soviet Union was not running out of oil. In fact, they're the number one or number two major oil suppliers to the Western world at this point. But the fact is that this was also part of this Team B idea. And what this did was this set up the situation where when the Soviets did cross their southern border, all the things that Team B had been saying about the Soviets being aggressive, that they're running out of oil, so obviously where are they going to go? The Soviets are going to go to the Middle East because that's what their objective is. And so when the Soviets crossed that southern border, these people in the Carter administration, the Pakistanis and the Afghans, knew that they had been lured in there to protect their southern border, but that was not the way it was played on American TV. The day, 2 days after the invasion, the former ambassador and Richard to Afghanistan, Ted Elliott, and Richard Pipes get on the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour and sit there and say, the Soviets are intent on conquering the Persian Gulf and eventually even Europe. They set the agenda right then and there. And so that was the beginning of the end for the relationship. Now, just remember that a big part of what was going on there was this idea that the United States didn't really have to do much. All they had to do was just convince the Soviets that they were doing it. And that was a big part of what was happening. The Soviets, when you read the documentation, some of which is in our book, that the Soviets, from the Politburo, as an example, they were having the declassified cables coming from the Soviet side of the issue. The Soviets were sitting around in Moscow trying to figure out what was going on in Afghanistan. They just could not figure out. At one point, I think it's Kosygin, who was I believe he was the deputy prime minister of the Soviet Union, stated, he said, it looks like a detective novel. I can't figure out what the heck they're doing down there. So this was, the United States is saying that this is all premeditated, that they're on their way to the Persian Gulf, and when you actually look at the documentation, you see that the Russians didn't have a clue in terms of what was going on.
By the way,
we have delivered this presentation to many groups, and in one of the presentations, one of the people who came to hear us was Charles Cogan, who is the chief of the Directorate of Operations for the CIA for South Central Asia from 79 to 84, which would have been at the time that Brzezinski was the National Security Advisor. And after we made this presentation about the true way the Soviets got drawn into Afghanistan and got held there, he stood up and basically said, what you've just presented is authentic.
And so basically you have had it confirmed, I don't know about the horse's mouth, perhaps another end of the horse's anatomy, but certainly in very convincing fashion.
Absolutely.
In public.
And it's of the public record. It's actually on our website.
And he actually stated that. He said in the interests of full disclosure, he did it almost as an official act that he was doing, of cleansing his soul of this particular event. Yes, as an act of full disclosure.
So again, for the benefit of the audience, and in particular for younger people who've only read the official history, what was presented as a club-footed act of naked aggression by the 10-foot-tall Russian actually was a trap in which they were lured into this in order to fulfill an ideologized worldview which had been brought in to begin with by the very same Ford Elder George Bush team that laid the trap for them, and that was then carried forward by Zbigniew Brzezinski. By the way, that 1977 report about the Soviets was also commissioned by the Elder George Bush's Central Intelligence Agency. The Elder George Bush, just like Bush II, an oil man, just like Dick Cheney, in fact, an oil man. So what Texans refer to as the business, we should never lose sight of how that figures into the entire situation. You alluded to Deputy Prime Minister or Deputy Soviet Premier Kosygin. One of the things that you present very in both detailed and convincing fashion is a portrayal of what the Soviets were thinking and the profound divisions in the Soviet attitude toward Afghanistan, even well into the Soviet involvement. Because we, again, don't hear anything about that. Again, it's all, we see the spires of the Kremlin and the stereotypes of the stone-faced Soviet Politburo reviewing the military parades, and we don't hear anything about what was actually going on in terms of the debate, and it was vigorous, and the very real divisions that were taking place. I wonder if you would encapsulate that for us.
Well, it's very interesting to look back to the 19th century and the British, because you had a very similar thing going on between the British and the Russians in the 19th century. The aggressive forward policy conservatives in Britain would egg on the conservative czarists and monarchists in Russia, and the two would basically encourage wars with one another. And the various military establishments in both countries, of course, would benefit from this. And so, but this was recognized at the time. This was all part of the gameplay that was going on in British politics and Russian politics prior to World War I, as an example. When you get into World War II, after World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution, this so-called Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill later described, what's going on behind Soviet lines within the Soviet Union becomes extremely secretive and extremely vilified in the Western media, okay? Because it's a challenging economic system. It's a system that's completely different. It's state capitalism versus free market capitalism in the West. It's not really communism, it's really state capitalism. And which was one of the reasons why it completely failed, of course, is because it was the head trying to run a body that it couldn't control. And so when you get into after Stalin dies in the early 50s, you get a complete change, a shift in Soviet attitudes. In fact, if you look at the issues that were going on in the Eisenhower administration, you will discover that Eisenhower was actually trying to ease off the Cold War in the late 1950s. There was a big conference he was supposed to sit down with Khrushchev at, and I believe it was 1959 and 1960, and it was the year of the U-2 incident. And what happened is that the U-2 incident blew it up right out of the water. He was told to lie to the Russian prime minister and to lie that it had been a U.S. pilot, and to deny it, and he denied it. And then, of course, the Russians produced Francis Gary Powers, the man who was flying the plane in military uniform. They produced the plane and the cameras, et cetera, and all of a sudden, and so Eisenhower looks like a fool. But he was led into that position by his own people. And so Khrushchev leaves the meeting, so Eisenhower's efforts to try to wind down the Cold War die right there.
By the way, we've spoken about that on these broadcasts for a number of years, and Colonel L. Fletcher, the late Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, Air Force focal point officer, in his book, The Secret Team, has maintained in no uncertain terms that that flight was deliberately sabotaged in order to embarrass the Eisenhower administration and to basically deep six the attempts at reconciliation.
Oh, yes, there's no question about that. And what's interesting, too, is that the people who were behind, I don't think your audience probably knows this very much, but the people who were behind JFK's election were this very same kind of neoconservative types that got George Bush elected. There was the same group of people. This is the military-industrial complex. And if you listen to Kennedy's speeches, we will fight any foe. We will go anywhere in the world to avenge this, to carry out our agenda. But then what you discover is that after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy has a complete change of heart. 1963 comes along, and he gives this major speech in the middle of 1963, in the summer of 1963, in which he basically says that we have to have a new way of dealing with the Soviet Union. It was pretty clear he was going to be backing off the Cold War the way, after 3 years, the way that Eisenhower was trying to do it. And of course, we know what happened to JFK.
Yeah.
So this is a pattern that you see over and over. Jimmy Carter gets elected in 1976. He's going to outlaw nuclear weapons. He's going to work towards a peaceful world. If you read Cyrus Vance's autobiography as an example, he talks about the outright feud that was going on inside the Carter administration between the neoconservatives, of which Brzezinski was considered by some people to be the leader. He was a whole heck of a lot. Paul Warnke, the chief negotiator for the SALT II treaty, I asked him specifically in an interview we did with him in 1993, would you classify Brzezinski as a neoconservative? And he said, yeah, he is, but a whole heck of a lot smarter. So you see, Brzezinski is a real game player, and the thing is that the United States, of course, is involved in this part of the world right now with its technological warfare once again that have already, they've used this technology again and again in various theaters of war. They used it in Vietnam. It didn't solve any problems in Vietnam. And it's not solving any problems in Afghanistan right now.
You talk about some of the divisions within the Soviet establishment vis-a-vis Afghanistan, and also you've written extensively in your book about your attempts at piercing the journalistic wall of silence about Afghanistan. I wonder if you could, because we've got about 10 minutes left in this interview, I wonder if you could dovetail those for us. The divisions within the Soviet establishment, your attempts at piercing the veil of silence or propaganda, and then let's move forward to what happened basically, the Soviets will pull out, and then in a future interview we can talk about what has happened since the Soviets moved out, because that has been an awful lot.
Well, one of the big problems that we saw from our first efforts was that the American media was completely looking at the situation in a very monolithic us-against-them point of view. And so we actually went to the Soviet Union and talked with the Russians, and we discovered that because of the involvement that we were doing with our documentary, and we actually discovered that they were not monolithic in terms of their thinking. They had their own military establishment. They had their own, the KGB and these various other organs, which of course are demonized in the West as being these horrible things, were not monolithic. Actually, and Andropov, who was the KGB director and who was very much involved in the decisions before and after the invasion of Afghanistan, became premier at one point. And early on, I believe it was 82 or 83, he became premier. And his effort was to try to end the Cold War right there and then. He decided he was going to make a shortcut, just as the way George Bush Sr. had been the director of the CIA, and Andropov had been the head of the KGB. And Paul Warnke even told us at one point, he said, he got played as this kind of scary Yuri, they referred to him as, in the American media. But the fact was that he was intent on keeping the KGB as a civilian operation away from the military. They did not want their own military-industrial complex to gain too much power, and that was always a big threat in the Soviet Union because their their hawks got together with our hawks and kept the war going.
What also happened is the whole war mentality completely morphs right into the media mentality. So what you really have in journalism is, journalism that's gone off to war too. And that's really what we came up against, was the Cold War journalism that had taken over the American media, vis-a-vis the fact that as a journalist you really could not present the Soviets in any kind of light other than as the evil empire. And that really became a kind of mandate, and that any story that tried to present, and we really think of it more as an issue of complexity. It's not just an issue of, someone is not telling the truth and we're telling the truth. It's that their story is so simplistic. When you reduce everything down to good and evil, there isn't a lot of room for complexity. And what we keep coming up against is this very complex world that doesn't fit into this very, very dualistic good against evil paradigm. And what we were seeing throughout the entire 1980s was the stranglehold that this had on the narrative.
So what we did was, in order to our own personal effort to kind of run the blockade, if you want to call it that, of news, and this idea of this monolithic Soviet Union, after our first trip and our experience with CBS News, we did a documentary. And at the presentation of the documentary, we got a very revealing evening. Some local people hosted us at a hotel in Boston, and they invited all of the local media, the Time magazine correspondents, and the Boston Globe people, and some international media people, and some geopoliticians as well. And the former ambassador to Afghanistan from the United States, who was at the time the dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, stood up at the end of the presentation and he said, "Who gave you permission to show this documentary?" So I questioned, I said, "I'm an American citizen. I don't need permission to show this kind of thing." He said, "Do you realize you are treading very closely to being a conduit for Soviet propaganda?" Well, Ted Elliott, the last time I had seen Ted Elliott was on the McNeil-Lehrer show with Richard Pipes, who had been the leader of the Team D project in 1976. And they were saying this was 2 days after the Soviet invasion, and these were the guys, he was one of them, who was carrying this agenda that the Soviets were on their way to the Persian Gulf. You see, which of course they weren't. We were piercing the veil at the core of where the veil was woven. And so he couldn't, the man was about 6'7", okay? I'm 5'9" on a good day, and when the world isn't on my shoulders. And it was quite an experience, and I was able to talk to the man in such a way that I managed to get a standing ovation in terms of defending my right as an American citizen to go off and do this. Well, after I got my standing ovation, Roger Fisher from the Harvard Negotiation Project came up to me, and he had just come out with his book Getting to Yes, which was really a bestseller, and it's still in, I don't know, it's 50th publication or something, printing. And he came up and he said, "Don't pay any attention to what Ted did. He's just very emotional when it comes to Afghanistan because he was there for so long." He said, "But if I can help you in any way, let me know." And I said, "Well, you can help me." I said, "How would you like to go back with me and we'll talk to the Soviets and see if we can get them out of there?" So he said, "Sounds like a great idea to me." So he said, "Do you think they'll let me?" And I said, "We can ask." So we asked. And in 1983, the Afghans said yes. Well, we got to Afghanistan. Roger was an international negotiator. He knew the Russians. He knew everybody involved in the issue. He got to Kabul. He grabs a taxi cab and goes over to the Russian embassy, to the Soviet embassy, goes inside. Their chief guy for South Central Asia comes down, and he basically tells Roger, he says, "Roger, we don't want to be here." He said, "We make mistakes, but we're not stupid." He said, go back to the United States, tell the media, tell Washington, give us 6 months to save face, and we'll leave the Afghans to fix this problem on their own. We don't know what to do. So Roger comes back with that.
We take that to Nightline, and basically Ted Koppel and Nightline presented the story in such a manner that there was no way that anyone watching that program would have believed there was any reason to consider even trying to figure out if it was possible to negotiate the Soviets out. And, we realized at that point that there was something going on that was way beyond the obvious.
Now, let me give you a modern correlation to that. When we tried to leave Afghanistan in 1983, we went through this whole issue of censorship from the Afghan government. And I finally did we got an agreement from the Afghans not to censor our tapes. when we went to Afghanistan in 2002, after the American involvement, we get to the airport, and as we're getting on the plane, the guy, he said, where are you? Why are you going to Afghanistan? I said, we're going to do news stories. He says, who do you work for? I said, we work for ourselves. He says, you have to work for somebody else. You have to be an authorized journalist. You have to be approved by the United States government and the Department of Homeland Security, blah, 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 blah. Now, this is the kind of thing that we could do back in 1981, 1983, throughout the 1980s, even throughout the Reagan era. We were not even questioned when we went back when we came back into the United States about the political content of the tapes that we had in our boxes, okay? It wasn't even an issue. The fact is that the customs official was more concerned as to whether we were sneaking in an Ikegami camera that we had bought overseas, and he wanted to see the registration number and make sure that we weren't sneaking in equipment that we weren't paying taxes on. He could have cared less about what was on the tapes. When we came back from our trip in 2002, we get to Customs, and Customs says, where you been? We said, we've been to Afghanistan. He's shooting pictures. He says, let me see them. That was the first question. And the fact is that as it turned out, we didn't have anything he was interested in anyway. I pulled the camera out and I said, there's nothing here that would interest you. But here's a good idea of if there had been, what would he have done? If there had been images of American soldiers doing what Russian soldiers had been doing, we would have got the same censorship that we got from the Russians back in or tried to get from the Russians back in 1982 and 1983, for which, by the way, we were heavily criticized for CBS News. We were told that we only got a sanitized view of what was going on there in 1981. We weren't embedded with Soviet troops. We were simply authorized to walk around with guards, essentially, who were there to protect us from rebel attacks. But now that we do this sort of thing, it's good for us. So this is all part of the mantra that your audience, especially your younger audience, has got to realize. There was at least what we had back in the 70s and 80s, and even in the early 90s, was a freedom that you guys out there today just don't have. It's been chipped away at bit by bit by bit by bit, and our government and our leadership has been doing that, and it's been happening so slowly and so gradually. You don't see it happening.
Paul, we are almost out of time here. Journalists are very much like flocks of birds. When one lands, they all land. When one flies away, they all fly away. Happily, you have broken out of the flock and have been presenting us with some extremely valuable truth. We've only gotten up through the Soviet involvement in Afghanistan, and your book goes all the way on up to the present, and even has a lengthy series of recommendations to President Obama. I'd like to revisit many of the points that we have yet to, I'd like to visit many of the points that we've yet to touch on in future interviews, but we are all out of time. Please tell us about your website.
Well, we have a website where you can get information certainly about the book and about also, we have a blog on it. We post things that we find interesting and anomalous, and, we just keep it up as much as we can. So it's invisiblehistory.com.
And we have been visiting with, and again, this is a book I can't recommend strongly enough. We have been visiting with Paul Fitzgerald and Elizibeth Gould, the authors of Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, just published in softcover by City Lights Books. And there's a world of history in between these covers, and listeners are strongly encouraged to get a hold of the book, read it, buy it, tell others about it. This concludes Side 2 of For the Record program number 678, interview with Paul Fitzgerald and Elizibeth Gould. This program is being recorded on July 5th of 2009. For Paul and Elizabeth, this is Dave Emory saying thanks for listening.